Can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? And what seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire?
So tonight, or this morning, depends if you're in California, we're going to be spending a lot of time with Keith Ransom-Kehler. Now, again, we keep going from one amazing, astounding person to another astounding person. And I'm going to be reading from A Love Which Does Not Wait from Janet Roux-Sean. I've cut out some things, make it a bit shorter, but not too short. So, without summarizing who she is, I'm sure many of you already know about her. I didn't know a lot about her, so it was a discovery, and it was just wonderful to spend time with her. So, on September 13, 1931, when she was on board of a ship sailing from China to Australia, and you will see that she traveled quite a bit, especially in Asia and in the US. Keith Ransom-Kehler wrote in her diary, 20 years ago today, I met Abdu'l-Baha, the beloved of the world. Be very happy were the first words addressed to me by him who knows the end from the beginning, and he has bestowed upon me that precious gift. To have seen face to face the pivot of the covenant was destiny. What destiny could be comparable to this? To have felt the pressure of his hand and have his command is an eternal blessing. Now, Keith was not a Baha'i when she met Abdu'l-Baha. She was one of the seekers who flocked to see him in London in 1911. She was a restless Christian crusader for many causes. She was 35, petite, pretty, highly educated, opinionated, and often mercilessly direct, with an inquiring mind and great charm. Now, the exact circumstances of her meeting with Abdu'l-Baha may never be known. If the brief diary entry written so many years after the event had not come to light, perhaps no information would have ever come to light about how she met Abdu'l-Baha and if she met him. Baha'is were so overwhelmed by the loss and by the stature conferred on her by the Guardian that her obituary consisted only of reports of the last 2 years of her life. And there was no biography available at that time. So Keith Ransom-Kehler was born Nanny Keith Bean on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1876, in Dayton, Kentucky. Her father was Colonel William Worth Bean. Her mother was Julia Keith Bean, and she had one brother. Her father's military title was not bestowed by any institution. It was that of a so-called courtesy colonel, peculiar to Southern gentlemen whose fathers had fought for the Confederates, including during the Civil War. When Keith was about 13, the colonel took his family north to the twin cities of Benton Harbor and St. Joseph, Michigan. But Keith always retained a slight Southern accent, which was in later years particularly admired by the Australians. Colonel Bean was a school teacher, but became a self-taught engineer and brought electricity to the Twin Cities, installing a trolley line. He was quick-tempered, and Keith was just as fiery as he was, so they didn't get along. In fact, Keith had a low opinion of herself because somehow she had never been able to win his approval. She was always grateful for the warmth received from her maternal grandfather. She attended Vassar College, famous as one of the best women's colleges, majored in child psychology, and graduated in 1898. Then she took graduate studies at Albion College and the University of Michigan, Arizona, and Chicago. When she was 25, she married Guy Ralph Ransom, that's part of her last name, and accompanied him to Paris, where she studied painting. He studied painting. They returned to the US around 1906, and their daughter, Julia Keith Ransom, was born in February 1907. Keith later had another daughter who was stillborn. Ralph was not a great painter or chicken farmer, became a professor at Albion College, and Keith taught French and English lit there. She was well liked by her students, always the life of the party. Sadly, and that's the first tragedy in her life, her husband Ralph died in his mid-30s of tuberculosis. Now, lately, all the people we have been reading about, they have suffered from all kinds of diseases like tuberculosis and smallpox and so on. Around 1910, Keith married James Howard Keller. That's why her last name is Ransom-Kehler. She always called him Jim. So with him, she went to New York. He became one of the city's most expensive advertising men. He moved in high circles. Keith remembered celebrities she met through him. Among them, the great architect Frank Lloyd Wright. So Keith and Jim enjoyed the romance of equals. They were both powerful personalities, and in New York, they maintained separate apartments, but not separate lives. Keith could be devastatingly outspoken, and Jim liked to compare her to a gun whenever she leveled an opponent, usually a man, for she had pity on women. Jim would remark compassionately that the poor fellow must not have known it was loaded. Nevertheless, she had a dazzling smile, a lot of interests, and tremendous joie de vivre, and men were basically charmed by her. She led a liberal Christian fellowship that was centered in Chicago from 1918 to 22. She was a star speaker, and in May 1921, she enrolled as a Baha'i. The year after that, she chaired the session of the North American Baha'i National Convention in Chicago. In 1923, she went south with Jim to nurse him through mortal illness. He passed away. He passed away. She was devastated when he died. So her second husband passed away. So she returned to Chicago, took a course in interior design, and worked at Carson Peary Scott, prestigious Chicago department store. She wrote an article on the questing soul published in Baha'i magazine and took a leading role in various Baha'i events. Then in 1926, she went on pilgrimage and met the Guardian. The visit set the course for the 7 brief years that remained in her life. Apparently, she was just an amazing teacher, speaker, and administrator. Excuse me. Sorry, I met someone and I don't know what happened. Sorry. So, Alex was there, yeah. So, she was Keith was fascinated by the Orient and by Oriental ways. Alone at dusk on the steps of the quaint old pilgrim house at Bahji, she wrote, "A mystical, beautiful chant arises. It is the voice of a woman." This is what she was at the Holy Land. The voice of a woman chanting, broken with sobs, tragic with longing, rich in praise. It is Laila, the cook, who in her humility has not even entered the shrine, but is kneeling on the garden path outside. Surely in her reverence, her obedience, her lowliness, her longing, she carries up to God in that a terrific wail, something of the desire of our tortured hearts to reach him. The white beds of stalk began to lose their fragrance with the coming of night, mingling with rose and jasmine. Lila passes me alert and smiling, restored completely by her abandonment to the spirit. Keith could appreciate Lila's passion, for she herself was, she told the young Marcia Gale, just as dramatic with God as she was with people. She particularly reveled in the chance to be with some of the Oriental Baha'is, especially Bahia Khanum, sister of Abdu'l-Baha, who was about 80 years old. She says she was exquisite, fragrant, imperturbable, assured she walks among the fluctuating conditions of the world. She noted that although Bahia Khanum made no overt attempts to reform people, she ennobled them by her mere presence. Her constant and self-conscious kindliness was in itself a state of grace. But Keith was most moved by the Guardian. She perceived that he wanted the Baha'is to go out and teach and immerse themselves in a sea of light rather than in a sea of troubles. But countless individuals wrote to him about personal problems and petty disagreements. He answered each one and he became exhausted. Keith saw that his energy was needed for greater work. She wrote a letter to the NSA, to the American Baha'is gathered at National Convention, and related the conversation she had had with the Guardian, during which he said, "The most essential thing in all matters is for the friends to work in harmony. For if they do not work together, there is no need to teach. There is nothing to teach. What we need is not so much a devotion to the cause, for this has already been abundantly proven and is being proved, but this love for God and for the Master and for the cause must be translated into love for one another. If this cannot unite two individuals, how can we expect it to unite the world?" With great tenderness, she described the Guardian in this way. She says, "This youth under 30, laboring day and night for us, sacrificing every human desire and tendency to further our efforts, deprived for our sake of all those natural satisfactions so significant to an alert and sensitive nature, with no more personal life than a graven image, no more thought of self than a breeze or a flower, just a hollow reed for the divine melody, any one of us is ready to die for him. But can we conscientiously number ourselves among those who are willing to live for him?" Longing to fare forth on his behalf, Keith was yet reluctant to leave Haifa, until Abdu'l-Baha's widow remarked, "You should be very happy, for you have the opportunity to go out into the world and give to others these glad tidings." Keith went home to New York, where she lived at the Vassar Club, which was she referred to in letters as her only address. She had a small income of her own and an extensive and lovingly preserved wardrobe by famous designers like Chanel and Lanvin. She once said that if she had to visit Buckingham Palace at a moment's notice, she had the clothes, but her elegance and independence certainly weren't synonymous with ease and indolence. The evening of the day she arrived in New York, she took the leading role in a teaching campaign. Ursula Rexford, a traveling Baha'i teacher, had been giving a series of lectures in New York. At her last one, called The Golden Age, she asked Keith to come up to the platform and told her audience of 500 that Keith would teach classes starting the next day in the ballroom of the Majestic Hotel. Keith then addressed a series of meetings, and at the last one, asked only people who considered themselves Baha'is to stay. The result was 35 new Baha'is, 31 women, and 4 men. This was an unheard of mass enrollment for the time, place, and the Guardian sent 35 ring stones as gifts to all these new Baha'is. She went to Barbados. So on her first visit to the conservative provincial small world of Barbados, Keith later felt the whole time she was there that All her effort would be in vain if she allowed herself to lose patience, even for a moment. She touched on the northern coast of South America and was the first Baha'i to visit some of these Caribbean islands. But mostly she concentrated on Barbados. She had a long article on the Baha'i faith published in 15 newspapers covering 12 countries in 4 languages, and she spoke in packed halls, schools, churches, and theaters. Despite, or perhaps because of several public attacks on the faith, her last lecture drew 8 times as many people as the first. Like a great actress on tour, she received rave reviews and left a definite gleam of excitement in her wake. While she visited a place, no one wanted her to leave, and after she left, they wrote to her asking when she'd come back. Nevertheless, in spite of all that, she was very lonely. She missed her husband, Jim, and the very qualities that entrance people, her beauty, brilliance, and forthrightness, also brought criticism. Now, so again, like Dorothy Baker, she was a great teacher and also had to take a lot of criticism from people. So from the Pacific shore of the US, Keith sailed to Japan. Her twin duties continued to be to proclaim the Baha'i teachings publicly and to educate her fellow Baha'is about how to manage their administration. Abdu'l-Baha had said that Iran was the cradle of the Baha'i faith and North America was the cradle of its administration. As the American Baha'is rose to meet the challenge, they were able to establish and incorporate the institutions according to civil law without opposition, and they incorporate their institution according to civil law without opposition. They could also champion their fellow Baha'is in other nations when pogroms erupted against them. By 1931, the NSA of the US and Canada had succeeded in drawing up bylaws for local and national assemblies, and when the Guardian asked them to send a representative abroad to teach pattern of Baha'i administration, they chose Keith. So she represented both the NSA and the Guardian. She arrived in Japan on June 25, 1931, was greeted by Agnes Alexander. Activities began immediately. After her third day in Japan, Keith wrote in her diary that she had been to a fashionable Japanese tea given by Mrs. Kuroda, wife of the famous virtuoso who is a member of the Society for Connoisseurs, and passes on the authenticity of art objects for the museums of the world. She was charmed by the highly refined household and the elegant gathering, but particularly by Mr. Kuroda's 85-year-old mother, though she found it taxing to return the deep bows with which everyone, including the old woman, effortlessly greeted her. She was thrilled to note a connection with Jim. Mr. Kuroda, a philosopher as well as a collector, had inspired the writer of an essay called The Gods of Tea. Keith admired this essay and had given copies of it to many people. Jim had been the one who first showed it to her. During her travels, Keith developed a routine of taking a rest day once a week. On her first day off in Japan, she got her hair done at the Imperial Hotel and then browsed through the shops on the Ginza all afternoon, fascinated by Oriental life. On another occasion, a solitary jaunt, she visited the Great Buddha, a bronze figure over 40 feet high, measuring some 35 feet between the spread of the knees, the eye, a yard across. Surely the serenity and peace of this figure are worthy to rank, she says, with the enkindled majesty of the maimed and broken face of the Sphinx, which so impressed me with its heroic spiritual ardor. The hands of the great Buddha are turned upwards in the lap, the thumbs and forefingers forming two circles and touching. In Buddhistic lore, this represents firm faith, but also signifies life as the moment between two eternities, each moment being the only contact between all that is past and all that is to come. So Keith knelt and said her Baha'i prayers ardently before the Grand Buddha. So Keith's rest days once a week refreshed her for the public talks, and her troubleshooting tasks among the Baha'is. But nevertheless, she felt tired as the day approached for her departure to China, and she took up a hideous chore of packing. She is like this like Martha Root with all these tons of suitcases. The silks and laces of her stunning wardrobe were not wrinkle-free, and each garment had to be carefully pressed, folded, scented, wrapped in tissue paper, and optimally placed in trunks and suitcases. No wonder Keith referred to her luggage as being mountainous. It usually took her 2 nights running to get it all in order. When she was finished, she wept as she bade farewell to Agnes Alexander and other friends. Then she received a cable from The Guardian in answer to one of Agnes's had sent, consenting to an extension of her stay in Japan. So Agnes and Keith spent 6 more weeks together, and it wasn't always easy. Agnes was a day bird, and Keith was a night owl. Agnes insisted on fixing meals for Keith, though Keith loved dining out and all the little pleasures that went with it. Remembering the old days in Paris, I stopped to have my portrait painted by a street artist for 10 cents, she says. Agnes thought Keith's mental processes were too complicated, while Keith found Agnes's mind to be distressingly vague. When Keith and Agnes worked together on a speech for a radio broadcast, the result, in which Keith's ideas were watered down to meet the demands of the Japanese censor, as well as by Agnes's desire for simplicity, didn't quite please Keith. She began to feel frustrated and confused as to her role as a Baha'i. So, as her real leave-taking approached, she was thrilled to finally view Mount Fuji, which had been hidden for weeks by rain and mists. She was also charmed with the temple in Masuyama Park, where she admired the poems on hanging paper streamers left from a feast in honor of the annual conjunction of 2 stars. Which stars? She said that nobody seemed to know, but as she sailed out from Yokohama for China over the vast swell of the sea, she copied into her journal a 2-line poem by a 5-year-old girl. It says, "Heavenly river, heavenly moon." On August 12th, 1931, Keith arrived in Shanghai and was greeted by the resident Baha'i bearing huge bouquets of flowers. She addressed the Baha'is, gave a newspaper interview, and found time to view traditional Chinese theater before re-embarking. Then on August 15th, 3 days later, all morning we sailed along the rugged coast of China and between islands, at last entering the narrow channel that separates Hong Kong from the mainland. We came to dock at Kowloon on the China side with Ling, the name of Fung Ling Liu, in the Chinese costume of peach color, waving welcome from the dock. Now, Ling Liu and her brother Chen Liu had both become Baha'is through Martha Root while they were studied in the US universities. They both now headed Chinese colleges. Keith and Ling, the girl, took a train to Canton, where Chan met them. Because of Keith's mountain of luggage, crowned with the basket of flowers, now battered from Shanghai, it wasn't easy to transport her to his house. As they alighted from a taxi, rain was pouring down, and it was only then that Keith learned there was no road. To reach Mr. Liu's house, her 9 pieces of luggage would have to be traverse 2 sets of railroad tracks, a golf course, a vacant lot, a deep ditch, and a fortification. Mr. Liu, a target for bandits in the rain and the moonless dark, stood guard over 6 suitcases and the wrecked flowers, while Keith and Leung, the sister, dragging 3 pieces of luggage, went to get the servant. They practically swam just to get home. So Keith kept up her full schedule of speaking engagements and felt she learned as much as she taught, especially in the arena of patience. She resolved to be very philosophical about all this, like the Chinese, and daily that resolve was tested. The next day, she left Canton, not very elegantly. She wrote, "We formed a quaint parade, the gardener, maid, Ling, Mr. and Mrs. Liu, a neighbor servant, and I carrying the mountainous luggage minus the spectacular flower basket back across the Gulf links to the taxi. At the station, Keith gave Chan money for his second-class ticket to Kowloon, and he went to buy it, but he came back with a first-class ticket, having paid the difference himself, and settled her in state in a compartment all to herself." She was very touched and very gratified. So we continue her travels, and I'm going to skip all the talks that she gave. But from Kowloon, Keith embarked on a Japanese ship over tropical seas to begin what she called her Australian adventure. The ship went slowly, meandering through the Philippine Islands, making frequent stops. Whenever Keith went, she enthusiastically bought souvenirs to send home. As the ship wended its way south, she wandered through the island bazaars, buying handcrafted batiks and noting no Americans can travel far enough to get away from Standard Oil and Camel cigarettes. Everyone on the ship spoke only Japanese, so Keith had plenty of time to add to her diary impressions of Japan and China and to feel homesick. She wrote a particularly touching description of a little boy she had seen on a train in Japan who reminded her of her nephew, so that she could barely resist the urge to hug him, and she still missed him. She managed to complete an article on Baha'i administration, for which she had many requests, and she said she felt extremely grateful for her trusty deck of cards with which she played solitaire. On September 3rd, after nearly 5 days of non-stop sailing, she reached Thursday Island, a bleak place, where she received Hyde Dunn's letter of welcome, telling her to join him and Clara in Adelaide. Of course, you know them, we're going to be talking about them eventually. They opened up Australia. So she sailed on down the Queensland coast through the Coral Sea. But she lamented, she said, I have begun to feel extremely old on this trip. And old is one thing I never feel futile, depressed, inexpressibly weary from time to time, but never old. She had no idea, no one to talk to, no one to dress up for, although she followed the tradition she and Jim had established of dressing for dinner. Fortunately, she soon had to be on her toes again among friends in Australia. At Brisbane, in pouring rain, with tears in her eyes, she embraced the lone Baha'i at the dock, and after getting herself some Australian currency at Cook's Travel Bureau, she bought her welcomer a festive bouquet at the flower stand. She managed to visit 2 more Baha'is and 2 newspapers, then went on to Sydney, where she met 9 Baha'is and addressed 2 meetings. That night, she took ship for Melbourne, a rough and cold passage, and was met by 3 Baha'is who accompanied her to the train for Adelaide. She found the train very uncomfortable, so she was far from rested when she was met on the station platform by the Adelaide Baha'is, who piled her arms with flowers as newspapers photographers snapped her picture with Hyde and Clara Dunn. Now, despite her fatigue and feeling of age, Keith couldn't have looked younger and more radiant. She never spared a smile. A week later, she reported that the Adelaide papers had called her calm, beautiful, and well-dressed, and Riley remarked, if you see it in the paper, it must be so. Keith's clothes were very much appreciated in the frontier atmosphere of Australia, where women longed for a little refinement and splendor. After one lecture, she noted, I wore my white satin ensemble to the satisfaction of all concerned. Because of the hectic schedule of public meetings and Baha'i gatherings, Keith's diary entries became less frequent, but with every entry, she caught up on reporting what she had worn for each event. She must have been trained as a young girl to do that, for a lady never bored society with repetitious costumes. She wrote, at the first lesson, I wore my ruffled taffeta and blue velvet coat. At the second, my red chiffon and purple velvet. At the third, my Lanvin satin with the loops and white brocade. Monday night, my rose silk and velvet with my white brocade coat, and Wednesday, my purple crepe with the purple coat. Also my court earrings. In the afternoon at Mrs. Mary's, I wore my orchid silk suit and wisteria hat. In the evening, my silver and black lace with the white coat. I hope you caught all that. For her part, she appreciated the custom in South Australia to presenting flowers. In this, they actually rival Hawaii. She said, everywhere I speak, I'm presented with beautiful and tastefully arranged bouquets by perfect strangers. As the lectures become more popular, the nosegays increase, so that at the last lecture, I seem literally lost in a wilderness of flowers. The platform is always a bower. Knowing my love of calla lilies, they're the predominant feature. She also enjoyed the kindness of the Baha'is and their love of music, Their custom was to have group singing and to feature a soloist at every gathering. However, an old jaw injury started aching and she felt irritable and disgruntled with herself and everyone else, for she had to minister to some tender egos while presenting the demanding standards of real Baha'i belief. She said, the people who are serving on the so-called assembly are not Baha'is at all. They have all sorts of reservations and evasions, so that now the real Baha'is resolve themselves to about five. Whatever her feelings about her work, she noted the precious duns seemed pleased with the results. Now, soon after that, she went to bed for 3 days for a complete rest, and then she was off to New Zealand. In a little speech of a craft she enthused rides the ocean like a duck. Her first week was crammed with engagements, and the Baha'is were inexpressibly sweet and kind. November 20 found her in a hotel in the eternal thermal region, Rotorua, armed with a letter of introduction from the Maori Society of Auckland to the Maori chief Mita Taupoke. So the Maoris were the original inhabitants of New Zealand. There were 80,000 of them in 1840, but just a few decades later, settlers had wrested their hands from them, and their numbers had sadly declined. The hot springs area where most of them lived was regarded as a wasteland, but they had managed to survive. So within days of her arrival in Rotorua, Keith donned her black lace and went to the village of Waka. Chief Mita Taupoke arranged the meeting for me at the central meeting house. She said, when I arrived, the little boy was sent to ring a bell through the streets, and as they pressed grandmothers and infants in arms, chief guide and college students with great cordiality and curiosity, the old chief, aged 85, arose and spoke in his native tongue, asking Keith's guide to interpret. He welcomed her heartily. She says, to what great matter are we about to listen, a subject of such urgent importance that this stranger traveling over many seas and abandoning her native land has to come to share with us, the Maoris, obscure and forgotten, her valuable news. We await impatiently the unfolding of her purpose. So Keith spoke, stressing unity in diversity and the value of Maori culture. Then many questions were asked. Soon after, Keith went to the Maori settlement at Oraki, near Auckland, for something called the Hungry, traditional Maori dinner. When we arrived at the settlement, Keith wrote, we were kept waiting a little till the elders of the tribe were lined up and ready to receive us. Then, at Keith's request, each member of the welcoming party grasped her hand and pressed noses with her in the traditional Maori greeting of Te Hangi. They proceeded to the Hangi, a small pit dug in the ground with wood and stones piled neatly in it. The pit, with layers of pork, potatoes, and fish laid over the hot stones, and baskets of shellfish on the sides, became an oven, and water was poured in to make steam. All was covered over with a large pan, some gunny sacks, and earth until no steam could escape. So, I'm going to skip her travels, to New Zealand, and then the adventure, all these islands, and Auckland and Australia. The adventure came that she was looking for, but only after a tedious voyage during which the exhausted Keith fell into an abyss of self-doubt, convincing herself that none of the other passengers liked her and lamenting, I'm bearing witness throughout the world to a light I cannot see. She kept to herself, playing solitaire in the smoking lounge. She felt stranded without center, enthusiasm, desire, energy. She says, I read the prayers, tried to meditate, wring my hands, cry aloud to heaven, but the skies are brass. She had read of the mystical experience of the dark night of the soul and commented, what hell could be more tormenting? However, the inner conviction in the existence of God's love remained, and she said, even as I have written the words that I'm too small for God to know, there stirs somewhere in the depths of my withered soul a faint assurance and protest. At last, she recollected the simple maxim of Ralph Waldo Emerson's that she had pondered as a girl: to be loved, one must be lovely. and she came to her right senses. She set to work quite mechanically to try to obey Abdu'l-Baha and attract people to herself for the sake of her faith. She said the atmosphere changed almost immediately. She developed a spirit of real fellowship with certain people who had been called to her. Now, she arrived in India. I'm going to skip a little bit India, but her itinerary in India, including all kinds of cities like Varanasi and Lucknow and Lahore and Karachi. She was accompanied by certain Pritam Singh. On the banks of the holy Ganges River, she was fascinated with the spectacle of diverse humanity swarming by the river and coursing through the streets. She marveled at the funeral procession with all the mourners and the corpse in its winding sheet, sprinkled with ceremonial pink stuff, closely followed by 3 wedding processions. She said, "We in our drab, colorless lives cannot begin to grasp the spectacular motion and beauty of Oriental pageantry." All these large parties. By the time she reached Agra, Keith felt deadly ill and could eat only rice and water and papaya. Nevertheless, she went to see the Taj Mahal because she was supposed to see that, and she found it disappointing, passionless, and glacial. But she admitted that her reaction might have been due to her own fatigue. She felt that the Indian Baha'is were passive and suffered from lassitude. Shoki Effendi had told her they needed stimulus, and she was giving it to them. She said, "I feel that I must exclaim, excoriate, protest furiously. Again and again, I have felt as if I had a lash of fire and light in my hand." In Bombay, she said, the Baha'is didn't respond favorably. So she said she thought she was about as popular as, as the income tax, until she allowed some assembly members to read the Guardian's letters saying the Indian Baha'is needed to be reawakened. She suddenly became, she said, a kind of Jeanne d'Arc sent to save Bombay. She was being ironic, but the lash of fire and light was ever more firmly in her grasp, and no matter how it burned her, she would not complain and she would not let go. Now, at one point in Bombay, she was stunned when the Baha'is told her that they had decided to cable the Guardian and asked her if she could extend her visit for 5 more months. And she had been looking forward to her next trip in Haifa. She went through agony thinking she might have to miss her pilgrimage because the Guardian always consented to extensions of her visits, but she managed to resign herself. She said, "Well, after all, I'm trying to serve the cause and not secure satisfaction." So soon after that, she took a rest day, her first in many weeks, went out to do some errands, and came back to find a man who was not among her favorite people waiting for her. She snapped at him, says, "I'm having a rest day." He replied, "Yes, but there is a cable from Haifa." She opened it and read, "Feel urge request you proceed promptly Haifa, preparatory extended summer tour Persia. Preferable revisit India in autumn. Cherish high hopes, your future services." Cable reply, Shoki. Keith was, she wrote, thunderstruck. She said, "In the first place, it had never seriously occurred to me that I was any part of the Guardian's plan. Of course, he had written encouragingly and directed me only, I thought, because he did not want to dampen my ardor and was encouraging my volunteer effort. But to find that I entered into his scheme of things was really astonishing. My next surprise was Persia, where he had already written that he was planning a European campaign for me. And my third surprise was his refusal of Bombay's request for me to stay for 5 more months." So she couldn't book a steamer right away. So since she had a rest today, she went to the movies. That thus, in a seemingly very low key, began her life's crowning mission, which was Iran. And that's what Ransom-Kehler is known for. So in May 1932, Keith arrived in Haifa to learn that her task in Iran was very important and most delicate, was to petition Reza Shah to remove the restrictions on bringing Baha'i literature into the country. Reza Shah had himself crowned king, the first of the Pahlavi Shahs, in 1925. He came to power as Reza Khan the Cossack after heading a coup d'etat in 1921. The Baha'is hoped his reign would be friendly to them, for his original impetus in government had been more or less secular than religious, but in April 1927 he joined forces with the mullahs against the Baha'is in the Jahroum massacre, during which 14 Baha'is were bludgeoned, stabbed, and hacked to death in their houses and in the streets. After that, about 20 were killed in other towns. So in 1932, Reza Shah found it expedient to be tolerant towards the Baha'is. Some of their progressive principles had become fashionable. Also, following Baha'u'llah's injunction, they were obedient to government, apolitical, so they were trustworthy. And the Shah, while appeasing the mullahs by forbidding the employment of Baha'is in the civil service, appointed them to the government posts, particularly those involving finance. He allowed them certain civil rights, sent his offspring to Baha'i schools, and relaxed an edict against the publication of Baha'i literature. People who weren't Baha'is began to greet their Baha'i friends with the Baha'i greeting, Allah Allah, as they openly discussed the faith in public. The ban on importing literature was viewed as one of the last restrictions facing the Iranian Baha'is. However, the tolerance was a facade and it was already crumbling. The Shah had begun as an anti-monarchist, but he was increasingly enamored of his own. It annoyed him that the Baha'is, following Baha'u'llah's of his hand as protocol required. He also had the constant fear of being overthrown, and if he became too friendly with Baha'is, the mullahs would incite the populace against him, so things were not as hopeful as they seemed. So the Guardian felt that Keith could meet the challenge, for she was, as he told the Guardian, as he told Marcia Gale, she's very frank, very sensitive, and very brave. He gave her books on Islam, and she stayed up all night studying them. His great aunt, Bahia Khanum, very old and frail, showered Keith with love so that she felt dissolved by her sweetness, and said to come into her presence was to hush and exalt the soul. Bahia Khanum would cup Keith's chin in her hand or soothingly stroke Keith's hand and chant a prayer or poem. Once when Keith asked an attendant, "Does she remember me? Does she know who I am?" Bahia Khanum herself replied with the title that meant teacher. She continually referred to Keith by that name. When departure time came, Bahia Khanum, despite Keith's protestations, insisted on being lifted to her feet by her niece to enfold Keith in her arms, and told her, "When you come to Persia, I want you to give my love to every Baha'i in all that land, to the man the same as the woman. And when you reach the holy city of Tehran, enter it in my name and teach there in my name." Keith later wrote how blind I was not to realize that she was sending her last message to Persia. The Guardian blessed Keith with a smiling farewell and remarked that she should be grateful to have such an opportunity for service. His smile and his simple statement sank deeply into her heart. So Keith entered Iran from the western frontier and visited the Baha'is of Kirmanshah, Hamadan, Tabriz, Kazvin, and other spots before going to Tehran. She was welcomed with tremendous love and enthusiasm in the village of Sisan, where there were 1,000 Baha'is with their own Baha'i center and schools. The Baha'is built a road 5 miles long for her car to pass over, and they donned holiday garb to greet her. She had her first meeting with the Tehran Baha'is, 150 of them on June 29, 1932, in the Baha'i Garden, 25 miles from the city. Her second reception was that afternoon outside the city gates at Baha'is home. The house was packed with people, and Keith, ill and tired, spoke briefly. The Baha'is felt the power of her spirit. They reported even before her words were translated. The next day, there was another reception, and Keith met with the Tehran Assembly. Because she wasn't feeling well, she moved from the Grand Hotel to the home of Rahmatullah and Najimi Alai. For Najimi was a nurse. At the Guardian's request, the couple accompanied Keith throughout her stay in Iran. She loved them and affectionately called them Rahmat and Naji. While lying on her bed one morning in their home, she suddenly burst into tears and wept for half an hour. It seemed so unreasonable, she said, for I had no idea what I was weeping about. The next day, a telegram arrived announcing the death of Bahia Khanum. and Keith realized the flood of tears had broken at the hour of her passing. How greatly I prize the ringstone, a coin, the pocket of Baha'u'llah, some raw candy, and a broken fial, not broken when she presented it, of attar of roses that she had given me, said Keith. And she prayed Bahia Khanum to intercede before God that the priceless gift of love which you so consistently taught us may descend unto my cold and untenanted heart. Keith's mission in Iran unfolded largely under the sheltering wing of 9-month mourning period for Bahia Khanum, with 9 consecutive days of memorial services in Tehran, 10 memorial suppers, and services in her honor every 19 days. Keith spoke at many of these gatherings and also gave a lot of public talks with emphasis on the equality of man and woman. She developed a great love for the Iranian Baha'is so that she doted on their faces, saying they were among the loveliest on earth. She was thrilled to visit Mazindaran, province of nightingales, wild mountains, and meadows where Baha'u'llah had roamed as a child. It fulfilled her heart sense of destiny, for she had seen it before in dreams and reveries. She wrote to a friend, the profound inner delight and agitation, coupled with scene after scene of my well-remembered fantasy, assured me that this was the place of my visions. She visited Barfurush, where one of the greatest disciples of the Bab Qudus had been killed, and went to the place of his martyrdom in the village square. She journeyed to nearby villages on horseback, Rahmat Alai walking beside her, balancing her all the way with his hand. After the aridity of Tehran, she was thrilled by the green countryside, and she said that the ferns, grasses, shrubs, and trees brought back the landscape of her childhood, and with it, glad nostalgia. For the first time in years, she heard the nightingale sing, and she remembered notes sweetly stirred her heart whenever she read the tablet of Ahmed. Lo, the nightingale of paradise singeth upon the twigs of the tree of eternity. Yet, she said, the welcoming chorus of men's voices singing as she neared the village was sweeter to her than the nightingale's song. The Baha'is tossed flowers in her path. At the turn of the road, schoolboys were singing, and then a chorus of schoolgirls, which particularly delighted Keith. Women carrying brass trays loaded with fruit, perfume, flowers, and incense sprinkled Keith with rose water and flung fragrant spices before her. Of all this beauty, she found the welcoming faces to be the most beautiful. In November, Keith made a special pilgrimage to Fort Tabarsi, and that place, about 85 years before, a hard-pressed group of 313 Baha'is led by Mullah Hussein, who raised the black standard prophesied by Muhammad, took refuge from the king's army and, starving and in rags, resisted the soldiers. When the defenders of Fort Tabarsi finally fell, it was not to force of arms and not to famine, but to trickery. Keith, with Rahmat Alai beside her, again journeyed by horseback. She jogged over winding, rough roads for 6 long miles, which included fording a river. On the steep riverbank, Keith learned it was in this very spot that Mullah Hussein implored those who were unprepared for the unprecedented difficulties that lay before them to turn back. Those who finally crossed with him remained to the end. Anyway, she said it was not ineffable ecstasy. Keith, as Marcia Gale observed, upheld her standards of dress, curling hair prettily, and wearing, when she addressed the Women's Progress Committee, a pink dress with a long necklace of pink and lavender beads. Yet she felt somehow broken and told Marcia, in the future, when I'm in my resting grave and people ask what I was like, it is your mission to tell them that how I suffered in Persia, Baha'u'llah's country. There were battles every step of the way. So Iran was going through this modernization, it was all changing, but the spirit of new pride in Iran as a progressive nation carried over into Keith's first interview with the Minister of the Crown. She went to see him in August, right after her arrival in Tehran, and he told her the book ban would be lifted immediately. She happily reported this home, but by January 1933, it was clear to Keith that his promise wouldn't be fulfilled. Baha'i books sent to her from Beirut had arrived in Iran. Customs officials had inspected them, and Keith had been told she couldn't receive them. She wrote to the minister but never received an answer. He had disappeared. Marcia Gale later wrote that he had probably been taken to a certain walled building outside the city where people suspected of disloyalty to the regime were summarily relieved of the burdens of existence via a so-called remedial shot administered by a doctor. Meanwhile, the Crown issued edicts against the Baha'is, which removed the recently granted civil rights, and the press virulently attacked the faith. Thus, under Reza Shah Pahlavi, conditions became worse than ever for the Baha'is because occasional pogroms were augmented by state-supported, consistent discrimination. Keith, at that stage, this tragic wave began to swell, rise, and rush towards the Iranian Baha'is, fought against her own growing physical weakness, and raised her lash of fire and light to defend them. How strange the ways of God, she said, that I, a poor, feeble old woman from the distant West, should be pleading for liberty and justice in the land of Baha'u'llah, who has given to the world its most advanced standards of humanitarianism and enlightenment. She sought audiences with government officials. Not all of them would consent to meet her, but with those who did, she was, as Shawki Effendi described her, frank, sensitive, and brave. They were far from frank, but their manners were perfect, suave, and charming. No emotionalism marred their constantly shifting presentation of the reasons, apparently improvised on the spot, why Baha'i literature could not be imported in Iran. Besides meeting them personally, Keith wrote them eloquent letters, rational but deeply felt. She also wrote to the Shah more than once. In July 1933, she addressed him, quote, "To my horror and grief, I've just heard of the burning on the part of your Majesty's officials in Kermanshah of the sacred photographs of Abdu'l-Baha. I am fully convinced that such a sacrilege has been committed without the knowledge of your Majesty. The Baha'is of the world as a body are willing to endure any degree of injustice and persecution with themselves, but when it comes to regarding with other than outraged sentiment a gratuitous indignity offered to that illustrious example of human perfection, Abdu'l-Baha, the Baha'is of the world arise in the full strength of their solidarity to utter a vehement protest." Marcia Gale has pointed out the little-known fact that the Shah was illiterate, and it is likely that Keith's passionate appeals never reached him at all. The only reply she received to any of her letters and to the petitions, the only reply she received to any of her letters and to the petitions from the North American National Assembly that she forwarded to authorities came from the Minister of Education, and it offered no hope of lifting the literature ban. Finally, the Guardian instructed Keith to depart Tehran at the beginning of autumn, travel through Iran, and leave the country from Bushehr around December 21st. Now, this was July-August 1933. Was supposed to leave then at the end of December. The night before she left Tehran, the Baha'is gave a large meeting in the Baha'i Center, and on Friday, September 22, numerous friends escorted her to the Baha'i village on the road to Qum, where refreshments were served, many pictures were taken, and last farewell spoken. In Qum, she met with the Baha'is and also with local government officials. She did that in as many towns as she could, clearly setting forth Baha'i precepts. So she wended her way southwards, addressing Baha'is, who gave her festive banquets, inquirers, and authorities till she reached Isfahan on October 6th. The next day, she visited Baha'i sacred spots, including the towns of two brothers called by Baha'u'llah, the king of martyrs and the beloved of martyrs. Keith had made pilgrimages to Fort Tabarsi, to Zanjan, where she astonished passers-by when on her knees and in the ruins of the house of a hero named Hujat, she prayed and wept, to the house of Quddus in Barfurush, and to the village square where he had been killed and mobs had mutilated his body. The place where he fell was an enclosed garden, and there Keith knelt and picked one of the blue forget-me-nots that starred the grass, like those blue flowers she sent so long ago from South Africa by Fanny Knobloch, who was a friend of hers, and very close together. After addressing the local spiritual assembly of Isfahan and its committees on the Baha'i Center in October 7th, she spent the 8th addressing the afternoon women's meeting and an evening men's meeting. On the 9th, she called on the governor in his home, met with the heads of the telegraph department and the police, and in the evening received and addressed a group of Baha'is who had traveled from villages around Isfahan to meet her. After they left, she went to bed with chills and high fever. The next day, she could not get up. Rahmat and Naji Ali Alai did not leave her side on October 11th. The illness was worse. A Baha'i doctor diagnosed it as measles. It became more severe, and the cable was sent at Keith's request to the guardian, asking for prayers. Then the doctor made another diagnosis, smallpox. After an anxious week and a half, Keith seemed about to recover. On Monday, October 22, she was able to dictate a cable to Shawki Effendi saying that his prayers were overcoming all difficulties. In her cable, she stated her plans to make her return visit to India and travel through Europe as the guardian wished. But an hour or so after dictating the cable, she suddenly became almost entirely unable to speak. The doctor said a nerve center was paralyzed. For 4 hours, she could still say, Ya Baha'u'lláh and Allahu Akbar. And she motioned those at her bedside to pray. Baha'i doctors labored around the clock to save her. But she died at 4:10 p.m. Tuesday, October 23rd, 1933. So that's the end now. And the writer speaks about how they took care of her, how Naji Alai, with another Baha'i woman, watched her body placed in a casket. A cortege of 600 Baha'is followed the flower-laden hearse down on one of Isfahan's main avenues to the cemetery, where the king of martyrs and the beloved of martyrs were buried. And there, not far from their tomb, she was laid to rest. Okay, I have a couple more pages to read here. The guardian cabled Iran. And he said the intrepid defender and the illustrious herald of God's cause has risen triumphant from the depths of darkness to her heavenly home. Her magnificent deeds were hidden from the negligent in that land. The Supreme Concourse knew of her worth. She possesses, the guardian said, she possesses the rank of martyrdom. And is one of the hands of the cause. He called upon the Baha'is, the Spiritual Assembly of Tehran, along with delegates, to go on pilgrimage in his stead to that venerated spot. It was a venerated grave. He cabled America that Keith's precious life had been offered up in sacrifice on Persian soil for Persia's sake. She encountered, challenged, and fought the forces of darkness with high distinction, indomitable will, and swerving, exemplary loyalty. He said she was a valiant emancipator of her helpless Persian brethren, and she was the first and distinguished American martyr. And her rank among the hands of the cause of God, he said, were eminent. He lamented his earthly separation from an invaluable collaborator, an unfailing counselor, an esteemed and faithful friend. So, in accordance with the wishes of the guardian, the Baha'is made a pilgrimage to her grave. There is a photo of the cemetery as it was taken. As it was then, a desolate spot, dusty, rocky ground with all flat stones lying over the graves. A line of jagged mountains beyond Keith's grave is covered with desert flowers brought by her mourners. One of the Baha'is sprinkled her grave with rose water from the house of the Baba Shiraz. They placed a large photograph of her on the grave and wreathed in it flowers. The photograph that had been made in Tehran, Keith daintily and beautifully dressed in full ensemble with a little hat, faced the camera with elegant and erect posture and a bright, if somewhat tremulous smile. A friend later wrote that just before the photo was taken, Keith had been weeping over her failure of her mission, but she held back her tears for the photographer. In one of her final diary entries, Keith wrote, read it out? Yeah, I have a lot of things on my screen. I don't know what all this is. Excuse me, I see this is normal or this? This is okay. Okay, this is it working? Are they listening to me? They're all listening? Right, there's just a lot of screens, a lot of stuff on my screen. So in her one of her last entries for a diary, apparently it's very important to have it. I don't have it, I just have excerpts. She says, I have fallen, though I never faltered. Months of effort with nothing accomplished is a record that confronts me. If anyone in future should be interested in this thwarted adventure of mine, he alone can say whether near or far, from the seemingly impregnable heights of complaisance and indifference, my tired old body fell. The smoke and dim of battle are today too dense for me to ascertain whether I moved forward or was slain in my tracks. Nothing in the world is meaningless, suffering least of all. Sacrifice with the attendant agony is a germ, an organism. Man cannot blight its fruition as he can the seeds of earth. Once sown, it blooms, I think, forever in the sweet fields of eternity. Mine will be a very modest flower, perhaps like the single tiny forget-me-not watered by the blood of Qudus that I plucked in Barfurush. Should it ever catch the eye, may one who seems to be struggling in vain garner it in the name of Shoki Effendi and cherish it for his dear remembrance. It was so hard to say goodbye to Keith that that year after her death, the guardian requested the Baha'is to make another pilgrimage to her grave to lay flowers on it, which he had sent. Voilà. Well, the story of a believer, the woman who lost her two husbands and devoted herself to teaching and to be of service to the faith, and to the guardian sent on a sacred mission to fight fanaticism and to help the Baha'is of Iran. And she became the first Baha'i martyr, American martyr, and an eminent hand of the cause of God. That's her life story. You know, and summarize it in 1 hour. hard to do, hard to summarize things in an hour. A life full of, but I think we all get a glimpse of how, again, one major figure in the history of the faith. And all these women are just all beyond belief. All right, friends. Yeah. So we say goodbye to her, and we go another week with her, and till we come to another gym, because we're going to find another one next week. So sorry to leave her so fast, but what can I do?
What was it like preparing for this talk?
No, I don't do anything. You guys probably do more than me. All I do is I read as much. I read what I have in front of me. I try to remove some of the things that would make it much longer, and read it a couple of times. And I spend the week. I'm lucky because you guys only get 1 hour of this. I get the week, because every day I do something in between my work. I come back to the books. I dig more things. I keep an eye on Violetta's work. I mean, what she has done. If you haven't seen it, I think you should see it. I mean, she has written a chronology of the life of Abdu'l-Baha that is being viewed all over the world. People make comments about it, and I hope it stays there, and that she has the strength to do part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5, because that has impact. That is bringing on the screen. Most people don't have time to really read big books, but allows people to get glimpses of the life, at least of Abdu'l-Baha, because we're celebrating this year his life. And we've been doing that for a year by talking about all these wonderful ladies that have been close to Abdu'l-Baha, and now to the Guardian. So we get close to our central figures through the lives of people that a century ago, accepted the faith in very strange ways, and served and give their lives. So anyway, so I get a chance to spend more time than you guys do reading, unless you have the books and you do the reading yourself. And in that case, you also get as lucky as I am.
So who's going to be, you are going to talk about next week?
I'm very hesitant. I cannot tell you. If Violetta doesn't want me to surprise you, to not to surprise you, I may have to come up with the name so that before you come on board that it's going to be.
Send it in the newsletter.
Yeah, Violetta would send it once I decide. Like I would take.
Wednesday or Thursday.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to run out of anybody, because I'm going to be digging. I'm going to be finding people right and left. And maybe I'm going to get one of you guys to be the one subject of my talk. If I don't find anybody, go to Laura or to Mariam and dig your lives and share it. And even talk to me about my wife, my mother, my daughter, Mariam, or even Alex. Who knows? Claudia, why not?
You can always use one of your parents again.
Yeah. But I read today something very exciting from someone I won't tell you because I just discovered it. Yeah, so basically, we have to create a library of just biographies, lives of people. And there is so much. I was reading. Yeah, I don't know if I should tell them about the story of the resuscitation of this guy.
Oh, you want me to give it to you?
No, I can't speak.
You remember it?
Yeah. I was going through trying to find stories for Violetta, but I mean, I don't want to give it away because it's going to be in her book.
It's okay.
Yeah, but
You can give it away.
No, I cannot give it
Tell
away. But it was just one of those things, I kept digging for things that fell in the period where Baha'u'llah was alive, and Abdu'l-Baha was Baha'u'llah was preparing him to be it, after him, that he told the family that, don't worry, because I left a document with Abdu'l-Baha because he will take care of you once I go. But Abdu'l-Baha in the book called Memories of the Faithful, speaks of all these people, right? I mean, there's so many of them. I don't know how he remembers them all by name, and he he spoke because it is a record of his I don't know who took notes, but somebody wrote it. It's an authentic Baha'i publication of Abdu'l-Baha, and he talks about
He gave talks and people took down what he said.
yeah, a certain person. I'm gonna forget his name. Let's not talk about the name right now, but he was supposed to be a scholar, an amazing scholar in Islam, and just stops, okay? And at one point, he was kind of fed up with the arrogance of the other scholars, you know. And he, at one point, he recognized the faith and decided to leave that scholar sort of mantle and become a worker. And he became a carpenter. He just left it. And he went to Baghdad and became a carpenter. That's how he trade. You know, Baha'is are supposed to work. You're supposed to make money doing whatever. He doesn't care. Baha'u'llah doesn't care what you do as long as you make money to live, right? So he figured, just forget about this. And so anyway, so during the trip, Abdu'l-Baha says that he was with him at night whenever they were going looking for food to feed the animals and all this. There was famine on the way to Constantinople. Abdu'l-Baha and him, this man that you know when you read Violetta's chronology, eventually, they would go from midday to night looking for stuff all over the place and then bring it back and so on. So then he ended up being a prisoner, and I've been living in the barracks in Akka, of course. And so Ben Abdu'l-Baha says that one day he was really sick, and so the doctor came to try to take care of him, and they kept coming to see him, you know, because he wasn't going away, whatever he had. And finally, he died. And Akha Jan, who was the amanuensis of Baha'u'llah, ran to Baha'u'llah and told him, this man is dead. And so he wasn't breathing. And so he went to Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah says, go back and ask him and pray. And he gave him the name of the prayer, a strong healing prayer. Say that prayer. Don't have the words here. So Abdu'l-Baha went, and he said that the body was cold, wasn't breathing. And they said the prayer. Yeah, anyway. What was it? Sorry. Said the prayer. He says, go and say. This is not it. This is Islam. I forget the name of the prayer. So they said the prayer, and the man started, the limbs that were limp started becoming, you know, came back. Started breathing. And the guy woke up. And he said within the hour, he was laughing and he was making jokes. This guy was dead. Dead, like, I mean, I don't know. They no pulse, I guess. It was breathing, limp, cold. That's when people dead are cold. And he came back to life. Anyway, so, you know, these are things that, when you can't say they're going to happen every single time on this earth. You know, people do die. You know, he died eventually, but he lived many years after that. So you get stories like that. You know, you start reading stuff. Like I read a story also on Islamont. Very funny story that when I did the Zoom, I didn't know about how he wrote the Baha'u'llah in the New Era. Apparently, he was in the audience, very shy, didn't want to go get close to Abdu'l-Baha because he was seeking the faith. You know, he came to like a fireside. He came, and he was sitting next to somebody, and then Abdu'l-Baha sent a translator to him. He says, "Bring him over." So he came. Abdu'l-Baha said, "You will write."
No, he said Mr. Esselman.
Sorry?
He said Mr. Esselman. He called him by his...
Yes, he said his name.
Yeah.
And said, you are going to write about this message. And the guy said, I don't know anything about this. He says, no worries. He says, you have to come and visit me. And so the guy flipped. He says, there's no way I can come. Obviously I'm busy. But I think Abdu'l-Baha smiled and said something like, well, wait and see. It's like, you will see what happens, And it turned out that 3 years later, he had this brain hemorrhage, and he had to take off, and was told to take a vacation, to take a rest, to warm climate. So he called Abdu'l-Baha because now he could come. He said, do you still want me to come? That's the story. So we get all these very strange stories, all this, the power of Abdu'l-Baha. And
Yeah,
the
but what did
world.
he say afterwards?
Sorry?
He went to Haifa, no? Did
Of course he went. Of course he went and stayed. So, but the thing is, yeah, he's probably buried in Haifa. Yeah, I mean, we went through the story, but I didn't get this part because I was reading something else where that woman was witness to a discussion in which he explained that to her. Anyway, the point is that, Abdu'l-Baha traveled all over the world, and his path crossed thousands of people and, touched many, and then others just didn't really pay attention. But so, there's all these mysteries, what happens in this life and who recognizes and what happens in the next world. I mean, you hear things like when Shawki Effendi says the Supreme Concourse knows your worth. I mean, he knows the Supreme Concourse. I mean, we don't know, but he knows. So there's a lot of all these mysteries surrounding the next world and what happens to all of us and why we should do what he's asking us to do. I mean, there's a purpose for all this, why are we supposed to do all the things Baha'u'llah is saying we should do? Why not just stay like that and just, because there's implications, there is the consequences of things, It's baggage you prepare. So when you come there, you're comfortable, you can function, because you have the tools to function, as opposed to doing nothing, then you got no tools whatsoever. So anyway, so we have to learn from the lives of these people. This woman was young, was intelligent, was sharp, was witty, was, lost her husbands, all of a sudden she's traveling across the world. And then she's sent on a mission to tough places. Went to India, was not easy at the time. This is before mass conversion, and then goes to Iran, of all places. And she contracted smallpox. Apparently, I read from the same author on something Wikipedia that she was holding, she contracted smallpox from a little girl or a little boy. She just, I guess, held her in her arms, and she got infected. I don't know how you do that, how she got that, but that's what happened. Because she held the little girl in her hands. And that was the end of it. All right. Well, I'm glad you guys could come. Nice to see you all. And
Thank you so much. So
yeah.
see you next week.
Yeah, thank God. Thank you, guys.
It occurred to me that
Yes,
if I may, our existence is circular with the lives of our heroes in the faith. We hear and we marvel at their lives, and we strive to incorporate their spirit into our own daily existence, and hopefully we can build on it, and it kind of spirals, or not spirals. It's circular. It's not it's an open circuit where this is a continual recreation of the spirit that these early pioneers for the faith exemplified.
Yeah. The whole purpose of all this is, as Shawki Effendi says, important thing is for people to love one another, to make connections on a profound sense, whether they live in this world or they are gone, because you're not going to tell me that because we're talking about Keith or Dorothy or or whoever, all these wonderful people, that as we talk about them, that they are not listening or they're not hearing this, or that we're not connected. And how do we know? We don't know. But obviously, something is happening that we don't know. It must be. The same goes with prayers. The same goes with the way we remember people, the way people go to the graves of people and pray for them. They pray our parents. And that's why you have prayers to say for your parents. And that's why. So the point is we should connect people. So we have to slowly get away from this culture of emojis, because emojis is a way of killing relationships. Because instead of talking to somebody and saying interesting things, all you're doing is sending some figure. Either you put your hand up or you put a flower. So, if that's how you're going to communicate, we're going to start doing emojis for the next world. We're going to just emoji God and say, I love you. So obviously we have to do something about this. We have to grow up and understand that the media is good when you do Zooms, because you're actually seeing people's faces. They're listening to you. They're talking back. They can write. That's communication. That's how we should communicate with the next world. It's almost like everybody's gone and we're talking to them. So that is fine. And so we have to make sure that we kind of understand that life is about the little things, and the little things is expressed through words. That's why God gives you a tongue to speak. So you have to praise people, you listen to people, you share, you listen, you're kind to them, you write to them, you write long letters. Now, even if you don't have to do mail in a postcard or put stamps in letter because we're so lazy that we just want to write a line here. Hey, nice to see you. How are you doing? Oh, that kind of stuff gets you nowhere. That shows that you're alive. That's all. It's a sign that you're not dead, but it's a sign of nothing else. So we have to grow up. I really understand that we have to cultivate, and you have to say nice things. You have nothing nice to say to somebody, you don't say anything. It's better, because life is too short, and so at least I have chosen, and you have chosen a little bit to remember all these people, that because before reading Keith Ransom-Kehler, maybe you guys probably are more sharper than me. You probably know them better because the way you react sometimes it seems like you know. But I didn't know much about Ransom-Kehler. I knew she was a very famous person, okay? And she was a Baha'i. I didn't know really beyond that Ransom was the first husband that died young, and Kehler was the second husband that died young, and that she was amazing, that she had all these clothes that I don't think any of us will own, because her husband was very rich and she worked for an advertising agency, and she had Lanvin, Chanel, and all this. And she just loved to dress, just like our friend Dorothy Baker. Both of these women are almost the same. Both died almost tragically. Dorothy Baker died in an explosion, for heaven's sake. Can you imagine? I mean, just, what is this? That's sacrifice to the highest degree. Terrible. So all these Baha'is are amazing, amazing people. But, we cannot be, any of us cannot be hand of the cause. We can be nothing like that, we can't. But that's it, there was a time for that. Now is the time for other people that probably will do amazing things, Yeah, I mean, you can do a lot of this, but it's all about action, and action is complex. The Baha'i world is not the same. That time was time people could travel and could become pioneers, because there were places that nobody had heard of the faith. But today we have no pioneers. But I'm telling you, you can be in any city in New York, be in Oklahoma or in Texas. I mean, take a city of, let's say, 1 million people. You can bet your life that in that million, you don't have like 100,000 Baha'is, that's for sure. Nor 10,000, not even 1,000. In some places, not even 100, right? Like the city where we go to in France, the small town, Chartres, there's not a single one, not a single Baha'i, except there's a woman there, an older woman, that somehow is the daughter of a certain man who is a Baha'i Babi scholar, okay? His name is Desassi. Abdu'l-Baha went to his house in Paris, and this guy was a Syrian origin, and Abdu'l-Baha, I guess, talked to him when he was, and this woman is not even a Baha'i, but she knows, she's proud that her father had seen Abdu'l-Baha, and she thinks that she, unfortunately, she thinks that because they were he touched, that somehow that's enough for her to satisfy her for the rest of her life. Doesn't want to go any deeper than that, but that's the only one that we have in Shaf. It's the only woman in existence that is connected to this sassy man who actually wrote something about Abdu'l-Baha and who knew him. Abdu'l-Baha came to visit him anyway. But the point is that there's so many people, and when you talk to people, most of them, you know, just sort of politely listen to you and then say, well, thank you, yeah, great, yeah, oh, yeah, bye. So, but what do? You do, I don't know what you do. You know, if we had the power of speech of this amazing woman, maybe they could touch their hearts and they could listen to us. But you know, but we're not responsible for people's reactions to anything. You know, we don't know. We don't know. You just have to open your mouth, and that's the easy part. The rest we don't know. So, all right, you guys.
Thanks
so
for reminding us.
Nice
Everything has to result in some action. Hopefully, we can resolve to act on this heroic story. Thank you again. Allahu Abha.
Thank you. Allahu Abha, Alex. And nice to see you as always. And Mariam and Farideh and Laura and Claudia and my wife Susie, who is not far away, and my daughter and all of that.
Oh, may I say something, Kamal?
Yeah, and Violeta says hi. She's not feeling great, so she's sitting here. She's sending her greetings to you. Go ahead there, Claudia.
On the largest Baha'i Facebook group, they had a talk of a short talk of Dorothy Baker.
Yeah.
Because you spoke last week of, you know, it'll be good to hear what she sounded like.
Oh, you mean you heard the voice of Dorothy Baker?
Yeah, giving a short talk.
I see.
It's on that largest Baha'i Facebook group. Do you want me to try to find it and see if I can download it?
Sure, whatever. I mean, I've seen something on YouTube, but it was very short. Talk to Violeta. She's yeah. Violeta say you can share it on Facebook. I don't know, share it whichever way. Or share it in Messenger or anything like that, whatever. It'd be nice to have it. Whatever you can do to share it with all of us, it'd be great. Because the one I found was very short, but it was in YouTube.
I think I know what it is, and tell them I'll include it in the next week's newsletter.
Violeta is going to include it in the next week's newsletter.
Oh, okay. I don't know if it's the same as you saw.
There's only one, I don't know.
Is it a talk to the youth in London?
Is it a talk to the youth in London, if Violeta says? You don't know? I don't know. We don't know what it is. Just share it, whatever form you can. Yeah. Be great. All right. It was wonderful talking to you. Have a wonderful week. Hope it's full of exciting things. And we'll catch up.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you
so much.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.
Bye. Thank you.
Sorry?
Here's the
Who's speaking? I don't know.
sorry, that was Dorothy Baker. It's
Oh.
10 minutes long, and it's from the National Convention in the US, and it's on the Baha'i Library site, baha'ilibrary.org or .com.
Okay.
Okay.
Just
Yep, I
Google
got it.
Yeah.
There's only one under Dorothy Baker, right?
All right. Thanks again, friends.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a billion. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Claudia, okay, when I'm feeling better, I'll look at the
Oh,
accessibility.
you're not feeling well.
And, no, it's okay. When I'm feeling better, would you have time during the week for me to test accessibility with you? We'll set up a Zoom on the same Zoom number, and then we'll see if it
Sure.
works.
Sure.
Yeah? Okay, so I'll try to figure it out and I'll be in touch, okay?
Okay, but you know what priorities you have too, and feel better, okay?
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I can manage. I always have time for you. Don't worry about it. So
Thank
I'll
you
be in
so
touch, all
much.
right?
Pardon?
I'll be in touch.
Okay, great.
All right. Love
Really
you.
miss
Bye.
you. Love you. Bye. Bye, Susie.
Hi. Claudia. See you soon. See you next week.
See you
Take care.
soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, sweetheart.